Nous allons passer à l'intervention suivante. Nous écoutons maintenant Madame Marika Razanen, je prononce bien. Vous travaillez actuellement sur un projet de recherche qui s'intitule « Repenser les reliques au Moyen-Âge » à l'université de Turku, en Finlande. Vous êtes chercheur invité à l'EHESS à Paris et vous avez publié, alors je traduis les titres, « Les offices médiévaux de Thomas d'Aquin » en 2019 et « Les reliques de saint Thomas » comme point d'attention pour le conflit et le culte au Moyen-Âge tardif en 2017. Et vous allez nous parler du culte de saint Thomas après la translation à Toulouse, donc en anglais si j'ai bien compris, mais vous pourrez poser les questions en français.
Merci beaucoup pour l'introduction. Et au début, je vous demande de m'excuser parce que je ne tiens pas ces présentations en français. Franchement, je n'ai pas courage. Je suis désolée. My presentation, it deals especially, it is within the Dominican order. I'm not going to speak about the cult widely in the cultural or in any ambience. It's basically in the Dominican circles. So Thomas's body and head arrived in Toulouse on January 28 in 1369. And please, if I'm not clear, please ask, because I'm very aware that my pronunciation is different than you are probably used to hear. So this arriving conclude a period of debate between the Dominican friars and other parties regarding the correct resting place of the saint's relics. This debate had taken almost 100 years, beginning Thomas's death at the Cistercian monastery of Fossanova in southern Lazio in Italy in 1274. Elias Raimundi of Périgord, the current master of the order of preachers, scrutinized Thomas's return by these words in his encyclical letter to brethren. Here you can see now the words which I'm going to read also, and in the image here you can't perhaps see the words because it's mutilated as you can see this particular manuscript, but luckily we have other witnesses. So when the immense piety of God wanted the holy body of our teacher, namely of blessed Thomas Aquinas, once professor, son, alumnus of the order of preachers, kept for a long time outside the gathering of his brothers, to be returned in our time to our order, the Most Holy Father in Christ and Lord Pope Urban V, divinely informed and executor of the divine will, solemnly returned the sacred body to our order at Montefiascone. Then the first reading of the Office of Translatio, composed to celebrate the translation feast annually, invites the friars to the common joy by these words: Beloved, let us exult in the Lord and rejoice in spiritual delight, because while the glorious transportation of blessed Thomas Aquinas is remembered, the joy of long-desired happiness is renewed. Indeed, great joy has been brought to the order of preachers when it brought its own treasure back from the being detained elsewhere. According to these cited texts, the Dominicans' joy seems to have been exuberant, but other evidence appears to indicate that the reception of Thomas's body and head, and especially the renewal of his cult, focused exactly on his relics, was not completely smooth, commonly shared, or unproblematic within the order of preachers. William Bonneville, a Dominican friar, commented on the modest adaptation of the feast. He explained that the reason for the unpopularity had been the very, this is citation from him, very mediocre nature of the office of translatio. Personally, I see the question of spreading of the cult as a very complicated one. And there is definitely not just one explanation to this issue. First of all, the translation of Thomas's body was influenced by many political, religious, and in many ways contradictory factors at play at the time. The political situation, together with the politicized message of Thomas's renewed hagiographical and liturgical dossier, was, I would argue, the root cause for the fact that the relic cult did not spread as widely as Master Elias hoped when the order had finally obtained the body and the head. So my aim today is to take a closer look to the sample of serving manuscripts which contain the texts most central in promoting Thomas's relic cult among the Dominican order, and consider their provenance and contents to understand better the time and place related factors which contributed to or prevented the early diffusion of Thomas's relic cult. And this is the hagiographical dossier and the text I'm referring to during this presentation. I'm not going to speak by detail of all of them because there is not time for that, but also thinking that this might interest you, that we have discovered other evidence of the miracles, and indeed, as Madame Fournier already informed you, there are more miracles in other collections than in this collection in Toulouse. And there's a little bit also the editions. This is not complete list. This is only to give you an idea if you are not familiar with the case. And then also I'm also contextualizing this my presentation in especially in two main issues of that period, and which are also of course overlapping, and they are the early reform in the Dominican order, and on the other hand the Great Western Schism, the beginning of the Great Western Schism. So one important context in which we must consider Thomas's translation and the success of his relic cult is the reform. Organizing Thomas's translatio to Toulouse was a major achievement of Elias, the master of the order, who was also an eager reformer. The Historia Translationis, which gives us a detailed account of the transportation of Thomas's relics from Italy to Toulouse, identifies the other key Dominicans involved in the translation. There were Raymond of Capua, Stephanus de Cumba, Petrus de Caisalis, and Elias's secretary Raymondus Hugonis. They all were reform inclined like Elias. I would propose that the involvement of these friars in the translation of Thomas's relics connected the imaginary of the transportation and Thomas's sainthood to reformist idealism within the order. The idea of the reform is very audible in the chants of the office of the translatio, and very illuminating example being the first great responsory of the office, Ecce Novus. The responsory was performed immediately after the previously mentioned first reading, and it starts like this. Behold, the new spring of the gardens, long hidden in the earth. It nourishes the rivers, watering the world from the heavens. This is Thomas, the light of learned, inspired by God. The words describe Thomas as the fountain who nourishes the earth and gives new life to its people. The responsory builds up upon Psalm 103:13, Regans Montes, which is watering the hills in English, which refers to the works of God and was understandable as an indication of the works of Christ on the earth. And according to Ecce Novus, it was now Thomas's turn to bring God's light in the world and help people to turn towards it. And that is, bring the reform. Master Elias's reform was rigorous. He had taken back, for example, all the privileges granted earlier by him and his predecessors, and his decisions were resisted in many places, including Toulouse. In Toulouse, the resistance against Elias's may have diminished within Thomas's arrival. At least, for example, the Miracula text seems to suggest that the friars collaborated with Elias in recording the miracles at Thomas's tomb. Petrus de Caesalis, later the prior of the convent of Toulouse and one of the friars who was trusted to carry the preacher's relics from Italy to France, presumably played a great role in stabilizing Thomas's cult as one of the presumably the major cults of the local Dominican community. Some of miracle narrations give an impression that the friars were promoting the arrival of Thomas's relics to Toulouse in neighboring villages. One recorded miracle tells, I'm here very much abbreviating it, this is only a part of the miracle, of course. One recorded miracle tells, for example, a story how Thomas Aquinas, the glorious doctor, began to be invoked in Rhodes before all other saints by the citizens in their ailments. And this was told when a woman who had had problems in laboring, according to the miracle story, gave a birth to a healthy boy after a vow to Thomas. The people of Rhodes are said to have learned laudable things about this new saint at the local house of the Dominican friars, so in Rhodes, not in Toulouse. Thus, the adaptation of Thomas's cult seemed to have been somewhat successful in Toulouse and its neighborhoods, but because Thomas's relic cult was strongly associated with Elias's reform ideology, it met with persistent opposition among the friars. A mark of probable opposition against Thomas's reform cult can be observed in the acts of the general chapters of the Dominican order in Bourges in 1376 and in Carcassonne in 1378. In these chapters, Elias tried to impose observance of the feast, as it seems to not have yet adapted widely to the annual liturgy in the Dominican communities. To win over the friars as supporters of the cult, Master Elias employed different means. For example, quite soon after the arrival of Thomas's relics in Toulouse, Elias prepared an encyclical letter to his fellow brothers to be sent in different convents. Together with the encyclical, he sent the descriptions of miracles which had occurred at Thomas's tomb or otherwise in connection to his presence in Toulouse. In the letter, Master Elias emphasizes his reason for recording the miracles and acknowledging them as something which will benefit the future of the order. Thus, he may have hoped that the fame of the miracles, many of which are indeed told in a remarkable affective manner, would efficiently promote Thomas's cult not only in Toulouse but also elsewhere. Elias wrote to have felt it reprehensible if he to whom a great treasure has been entrusted with devout prizes did not exalt these miracles on earth in every way. We do not know in how many copies or to where Elias sent the letter, but we can presume that he sent it to the several central convents of the order, from where he hoped that the surrounding convents would again gain a copy for themselves. Evidence about these letters can be found in 2 major Italian cities where the early reform was successful. Thus, 4 of these copies of encyclical letter and the following miracle collection are surviving. One copy is this copy here in Toulouse, a famous manuscript 610, which is already referred several times, and which is at the exhibition also. And please go to see the exhibition if you haven't yet. It's really amazing. And the other 3 seems to originate from Italy. The oldest one, which is a part of so-called Cividale legendary, now in Bologna, was copied at the famous scriptorium of Tommaso Caffarini di Siena in Santissimi Giovanni e Paolo in Venice. The convent and its scriptorium, as well as Tommaso Caffarini, were important supporters of early reform in the order. Venice was in fact the first Italian city in which the Dominican observance reform was introduced by Giovanni Dominici in 1391. The Cividale manuscript was produced around the years 1409 and 1410. It contains basically the whole hagiographical dossier of Thomas's translation. That means that it contains the long Historia Translationis, the readings for the office of translatio, called a sermon in this manuscript, and the encyclical together with the miracles. What makes the manuscript extremely interesting is the fact that the long Historia is different, like a draft or original one, compared to the version which is here in the Toulouse manuscript. Why the draft version was in Venice, as it was written here in Toulouse, is an interesting question, and the answer to it might be somehow connected to the early observant reform. We know that Tommaso Caffarini of Siena gathered lives of Dominican saints and other textual tradition of the order to the library of Santissimi Giovanni e Paolo. His copies transcribed these texts to the numerous manuscripts which diffused from Venice, especially to other Reformed Dominican houses. There is still one copy at the Biblioteca Nazionale of Venice today, which I suspect to have been produced at the Caffarini's scriptorium as well. This copy contains only the encyclical and the miracles regarding Thomas's translatio. The third manuscript is presumably a Florentine or perhaps Fiesole origin from the first quarter of the 15th century. Also, the origin of this manuscript points towards a context of reform introduced by Giovanni Dominici and Tommaso Caffarini in this period in Tuscany. This last copy, now at the Pinnacle Library in Yale, US, is a recent discovery, giving us also a reason to hope that 1 or 2 more copies may surface. Interestingly, this manuscript contains the encyclical, the miracles, and the office of translatio, but without readings. One might have expected that Thomas's new hagiographical dossier would have been adapted more quickly in the convents that were inclined to reform. At this point, however, it must be remembered that the Western Church and the Dominican order divided into 2 camps following the Roman and Avignon papacy quite soon after the preparation of the texts and office to remember and celebrate Thomas's translatio. So, in the context of the schism, there can be no doubt that the reverence for Thomas's remains became identified as supporting the Avignon obedience. The principal reason for connecting the cult to the schism is the same as relating to the cause to the reform. The people behind the translation and the remodeling of Thomas's cult. The most important character is Elias, who became the master of the obedience of Avignon. Also other reformers who were involved in the transportation of the relics, Stephanus de Cumba, Petrus de Caesalis and Raymondus Hugonis, took the Avignon side. Only Raymond of Capua challenged, as we well know, Elias by becoming the master of the Roman obedience. Interestingly, the final version of the Historia Translationis, written at the beginning of 1370s, that is, before the official rupture in the schism, had already diminished the role of Raymond of Capua in the story. According to the original text, Raymond gave important help to Elias by asking the reformed nuns in Montepulciano to pray that the Dominicans would receive Thomas's body from the Cistercian monks. In fact, the transportation of Thomas's relics presumably contributed to worsening relationship between Italian and French Dominicans. One very interesting and easily recognizable sign of the poor terms between Italians and French friars can be found in the manuscript originating from France, perhaps even Saint-Jacques of Paris. Saint-Jacques was among the rare convents which conserved one of Thomas's bodily relics, his arm, which was given to the King of France in summer 1369 and deposited by the Dominicans. The manuscript which illuminates the situation within the Dominican order is a breviary, now in a Bibliothèque Mazarin in Paris, and it contains the text for the translation office in an additional gathering. Giving the exact date to the addition is difficult, and we cannot be sure whether the gatherings were copied before or after the beginning of the schism, but presumably after. I start explaining the unique testimony of the breviary, giving first the beginning of the common version of the office. And the common version is that on our left side. And this is the first antiphon for the first Vesper of the Translatio feast. And it starts, "Oh, how happy you are, Mother Italy, who have given the birth to the ray of a new sun. Equally happy are you, Gaul, who have received the cloak of this sun. O Toulouse, the magnificent feast will bring you a perpetual light." I would highlight that these two lines, which I have highlighted, clearly emphasize the equality of Italy and France promoting Thomas's sanctity. But in the case of our so-called Parisian breviary, the formulation is different, as you can see here in this right side example. It says, "Oh, how happy you are, Mother Italy, who have given birth to the ray of a new sun. Oh, how rich have you become, Gaul, who have received the cloak of the sun." So it clearly gives more emphasis to Gaul and gives new importance for Gaul as France, as being deposited Thomas here in Toulouse. This is one example of a complicated relations between French and Italian Dominicans. This may even be a direct sign of the schism of which the French Dominicans mainly remained loyal to Avignon obedience. There exist interesting differences in liturgical manuscripts, differences which could be studied contextualizing them more thoroughly than it has been done so far, but this task would also be quite demanding, as there are a lot of surviving examples of the office of translatio, especially in Dominican breviaries. I would like to present here one group of liturgical manuscripts with chants for Thomas's translation feast. This group originates from the Dominican convent of Colmar. Colmar, as we know, was reformed early. The master of Roman obedience, Raymond of Capua, had granted a license in 1389 to Conrad of Prussia to reform the Dominican male convent of Colmar. The municipal library of Colmar conserves a remarkable collection of Dominican liturgical manuscripts, which date more or less from the period of the reform. Additions made to the manuscripts are at the turn of 14th and 15th centuries, and they include as a norm the liturgy for Thomas's translatio. Christian Meyer, the editor of the Catalogue of Annotated Manuscripts, seem to think that the feast was added to the codices soon after its confirmation, that is, after the year 1370, and before the end of the century. On the grounds of the earlier discussion, we may be quite relaxed and say that the feast was not adapted to the liturgy of the convent before its reform, 1389. In that moment, the schism would already have divided the order of preachers, and perhaps adopting the liturgy was more a response to seeking unity between the rival Dominican obediences, those of Rome and Avignon, than the direct act of the reform. This new phase in seeking the unity seems to have begun within the nomination of Thomas of Firmo as the master of the Roman obedience in 1401. In the same year, he started to enforce the order to adapt the feast of Thomas's Translatio as a part of the Dominican liturgical year in the Roman side. Earlier, I demonstrated how the Cividale legendary was related to the reform, and now I would add that bounding its gatherings together, this manuscript, it contains really a very varied collection of legends of saints, and they are all, or most of all, written by different hands. So this manuscript relates also the reunification of the order after the schism. In 1409, when Alexander V was elected as Pope in Pisa, Master Thomas de Firmo was keen to believe in the unification of the Church and followed the Pisan obedience, or Pisan Pope. Alexander declared Thomas de Firmo as the one and only master of the order that same year. Cividale legendary assembled in 1409 and 1410 collected lives of saints from both sides of the schism, Thomas's relic cult being the most remarkable Avignon cult. In this context, a Cividale legendary must necessarily be interpreted as a politicized history text aiming at reconstruction of the unity of the Dominican order again under a single master, although unfortunately we know that it didn't happen yet, the unification, but there were actually 3 different obediences in the beginning of the 15th century. So the diffusion of Thomas's translation feast may have been slow, and it seems to have both profited and suffered from the ongoing attempts to reform the order. Similarly, the schism had surely effects which first prevented, but later even fostered the promoting of Thomas's relic cult. I presume that after all, the celebrations of Thomas's relics were steadily embraced by the whole order, even its northernmost convents, as demonstrates an example from the Diocese of Turku, Finland, to which diocese I belong. So I couldn't resist to give this example to you. We have a surviving collectarium, that is a personal liturgical book containing especially collects prayers for the Mass among the other liturgical material. From the inscription in the end of the manuscript, we know that in 1407, The book belonged to Benedict, who was presumably a friar from the Dominican convent of Turku or Viborg. These were two Dominican convents in medieval Finland. And the book contains later additions from the 15th century, and among them there are 3 biblical prayers for different hours of Thomas's translation feast. Several earlier and later additions demonstrate to us that the manuscript has been in active use, the manner of which also indicates the conscious choice to venerate Thomas's relics in Diocese of Finland and among the brethren there. You may, I don't know if it's clear enough, but the addition is here. It's written here in Translatione Sancti Tome d'Aquino, and it gives the prayers. So with this example, I conclude my presentation. Based on the evidence with which I'm familiar, I would say that the surviving translatio texts and chants can often be deciphered as complex testimonies of religious and political influence of their time. And they would profit more detailed studies also. However, what is clear is that office of the translatio, its chants, prayers and readings were disseminated much more widely than other texts about the translation, which of course is natural due to their nature as liturgical texts. It is also very significant to note that these songs and readings summarize the long narrative of the Historia Translationis text and the collection of the miracles. This means that Thomas's miracles at his tomb in Toulouse, for example, were chanted, venerated, and promoted as a part of the antiphons and great responsories of the Matin service. And surely it is not correct to say that the friars experienced the translation office as a mediocre. Musically, it was based on the Dies Natalis office of Saint Dominic. And this is, I think, this is very important to notice. And luckily, because I must now quit, I have used my time. But tomorrow we will listen more about this music when Hilkka-Liisa Vuori gives her presentation. So, thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions donc, qui peuvent être en français?
Oui, bien sûr. Si je ne comprends pas, peut-être c'est quelqu'un qui me peut aider. Et puis, peut-être je peux répondre en anglais ou en italien, finnois.
Oui.
Yes, I would like to know if it's possible to figure out how long these offices have been sung until the 16th century, middle of 16th, and after there is some example of after the Protestant domination.
Do you mean for how long in Finland or
yes,
in general?
Yeah, in Finland, yes.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, and I don't have a very good answer to that. But the Reformation it wasn't very rigorous in Finland, so it's evident that they continued to use medieval and let's say the Catholic material also during and after the Reformation, but for how long that I can't say. The more rigorous period, it came in the 17th century, and then it very presumably stopped. But on the 16th century, I would say that there were mixed traditions. There were some new songs, but also the old ones were used.
Just to know if in the 16th century the confrontation between Catholic and Protestant was violent in Finland, or it was soft, more soft than in France, for instance?
It was quite soft, actually,
Yes.
yeah. And you may know that there are a lot of medieval churches in Finland which were changed as Lutheran ones, and even the decoration, mural paintings, and other furnitures they were kept as they were, and people actually were very fond of them. So there are even lamentations. We know that some people lamented that altar and altar triptych or something like that, when a priest wanted to take it off from the wall, the people were, no, we love it. It's very important to us. So yeah, and that's why also we do have actually percentuality thinking. We has quite a big medieval cultural heritage in Finland.
I wonder about the connection of the two feasts celebrated in Toulouse, the one on the 28th of January and the second one on 7th of March. The officium that you have published with the medieval manuscripts in Toulouse, does it concern, which feast does it concern? The one of the Translatio or the one of in March?
That is also a very good question, I think, because it contains this Translatio feast as many all the other manuscripts have, but it has also a Dies Natalis feast, but that's not a common one. It's actually, I know, in this Toulousan manuscript is the only example I know of this Dies Natalis. It's not the normal Dies Natalis which is here, but I can't explain why. Perhaps, I don't know, the people who have studied more the manuscript can answer.
Do you know what was the status of that Feast of Translatio in January before the liturgical reform? In the frame of the order, I mean.
As far as I know, it was celebrated as all the feasts in a totum duplex in the highest category of Dominican feast in Dominican order.
But at what time did that adopt that high status?
There aren't any. For example, I think there aren't any acts or any evidence. So I don't know, really, but from the liturgical manuscripts, I can see that it has been always celebrated in the highest category, and then you certainly know this better than I. That then in the liturgical reform in the 17th century, it was dropped from the liturgical books, but like 100 years later, it was reintroduced again. But in that phase, it was different. It wasn't anymore the medieval one.
Vous avez dit que l'office de saint Thomas ressemble à celui du Dies Natalis de saint Dominique. Est-ce que vous avez une considération, une interprétation sur cette cause, ou c'est juste ils avaient besoin de quelque chose et donc ils ont copié?
Yes, thank you. Because it's so much easier to me to answer in English, I presume. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it is a contrafacta of Thomas's translatio feast is contrafacta for Dominic's Dies Natalis. It means, musically, Hilkka-Liisa can explain better what it means, but for me as a historian, it means that here in Toulouse, Elias Raimundi wanted to give a very strong emphasis to the Thomas's cult. He wanted Thomas's cult to become something equal, if I may say so, with the Dominic's feast and cult.
Did it really on that purpose?
Yes, that's my opinion. Yes. There is a question, please.
Sorry, apart from the Dominican Institute and intellectual milieu, what other impact do those celebrations or the cult of St. Thomas has on the general, church level interest and sometimes suspicion or, being suspected of being an intellectual saint has any negative impact on the cult?
Thank you. Very, very interesting question, and I definitely have a complete answer. But for example, in the region where Thomas's cult originally was, it started in Italy, in Fossonova and around Fossonova, and there the cult wasn't the cult of intellectual. It was cult of a great thaumaturg, a saint who cures people, and he was as so many other saints of that period, and yes, the Dominicans then later kind of perhaps labeled the cult more intellectual. They brought their intellectual background to Thomas's cult. That's certain, as we have already heard also. But I don't know. I just now I can't remember any example of a negative attitude. That's probably also because all the negative normally, if in Middle Ages something was regarded as negative, it's so long ago that we have lost the negative evidence. We normally keep surviving the positive evidence. So that might be also one thing. But for example, in Finland, which is very far from here, and for me it seems that Thomas's cult there, this Dies Natalis cult, because it really arrived in Finland, it was important. Thomas was kind of he was, as the Pope John 22nd saw Thomas, I think he saw him as a kind of a warrior of church, someone who sustains church, who is doing great work. His doctrine was important for the church, and he sustained the whole institution. And I think that was, for example, one reason why Thomas's cult was successful in Finland. Finland was a not perhaps even not anymore a pagan country, but anyway, the faith wasn't very deep in the people's mind. So Thomas's cult very probably was used in Finland. It was important for the friars because they found from Thomas a helper to their missionary work in Finland. That's something that at least, that is again my opinion, but there's also evidence that Thomas was quite, he was a remarkable saint in Finnish Dominican circles.
Merci beaucoup.
Bien, je vous remercie. Donc, avant de nous retrouver demain matin pour la dernière journée, donc à 9 h, donc je vous donne quelques informations. Monsieur Mogg, qui devait intervenir au titre de recteur, ne le peut pas demain matin. Donc, je remplacerai son intervention par un bref texte de Monsieur Muse, comme il faut prononcer, en français, que nous avons traduit, prendra la place de Monsieur Mogg. Si vous regardez votre plan, il était annoncé, mais il ne peut pas venir demain matin. Pour le reste, donc je vous invite, alors les reliques sont encore visibles ce soir jusqu'à 18h30, de même l'exposition Saint-Thomas jusqu'à 18h30, et nous nous donnons rendez-vous à 20h à l'église Saint-Exupère pour le concert de l'ensemble Perrotin-le-Grand au docteur Optimé, où vous aurez justement des pièces de l'office de Saint-Thomas et de l'office du Saint-Sacrement. Donc on se donne rendez-vous à 20h à Saint-Exupère. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.